Welcome back, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into a case that I think you'll find both fascinating and tragic. The New Bedford Highway Killer.
Yeah, a case that really gripped that region in the late 80s.
Right, and it's still unsolved.
Absolutely still
Ton.
unsolved.
So many
So
questions.
many questions, and even decades later, people are still trying to figure out what happened.
Exactly. So we have a Wikipedia article and some excerpts from a book on the case, and we're going to try to piece together what we know about the victims, the suspects, and the lingering mysteries, basically.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that it just stays with you, even all these years later.
For sure, for sure. So let's set the stage for our listeners. New Bedford, Massachusetts, between 1988 and 1989, the bodies of 11 women were found along highways in the area.
Route 140 and I-195 primarily.
Yeah, and what's really sad is that many of the victims were involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, which really made them vulnerable.
And that's one of the things that is so heartbreaking about this case is that it really preys on that vulnerability. It's a reminder of how marginalized communities can become targets.
Right, and how these cases often bring to light sort of these larger societal issues.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the victims themselves. I think it's really crucial to remember that each of these women had a story, you know. And the first victim discovered was Debra Medeiros.
Now, she wasn't the first to go missing.
Right, right. She was the first one they found.
Right.
And she was 29 years old, and her remains were found in a wooded area off of Route 140.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that her body was found posed in a very specific way.
Yeah, on her back with her feet towards the highway.
Right. And that's a detail that investigators always look for, those little details,
Yeah.
what we sometimes call a signature.
Right, could be a huge clue.
It could be a huge clue. Does it offer some insights into the killer's psychology or their motives? Was it just a way of dehumanizing the victims? Was it some sort of ritualistic element? Those are the questions that always come up.
Yeah, it's definitely creepy. And to make it even more complex is that, another victim, Nancy Piva, was found in the same pose.
36 years old. She was last seen walking home from a bar.
Right, and to make things even more complicated, some of her belongings were found with another victim, Deborah DeMello.
Right, 35 years old.
So, was this like a deliberate act by the killer to kind of link the victims? Was it a way to taunt the police, or could it have been a careless mistake?
Or do they know each other?
Yeah, were they connected somehow before?
Before their deaths, that's always a question.
Right, right. It's like trying to decipher a code, right? Every little detail could be a clue.
Absolutely.
Another victim, Deborah McConnell, she was 25 years old.
And she was found with a bra wrapped around her neck.
Right, and this detail was found with other victims as well, suggesting a possible ritual or, a specific fantasy the killer was acting out.
That's what investigators are always looking for, is consistency. Because that points to a possible MO, a method of operation, and understanding that MO can be really helpful, in narrowing down the pool of suspects.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so then there was Rochelle Dupirala,
28 years old when she disappeared.
and her body was discovered months later, and she had been brutally beaten to death.
And this is where it gets interesting because Rochelle had a connection to one of the main suspects, Kenneth Ponte.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're going to get into him a little bit later, but that just shows you how, sometimes the killer can be someone, surprisingly close to the victims.
Closer than you think.
Yeah, it's a chilling thought. Mary Rose Santos was another victim,
She was 26.
and her case also ties back to Ponte. He had actually represented her in a legal matter before she disappeared and even helped her husband, create flyers when she went missing.
Right. So it kind of makes you question, was he genuinely trying to help, or did he have ulterior motives? Was he trying to insert himself into the investigation for more sinister reasons?
Right. Yeah, that's really suspicious. Um, Now, Robin Rhodes is an interesting case because unlike many of the other victims, she wasn't involved in sex work.
Right. She was 29 years old, and she knew a
Wow.
lot of the other victims.
Yeah, so could this suggest a link beyond just circumstance? You know?
Right. Could there be some sort of social network that connected all of these women?
Yeah, did they frequent the same places or have mutual friends?
Exactly. And that's where, really getting into the details of their lives could help you understand the killer's motives.
Okay, so two other victims, Christina Montero, she was 19, and Marilyn Cardozo Roberts, who was 34, they vanished without a trace.
Their bodies were never found.
I mean, how awful is that? It just adds another layer of tragedy to this already, heartbreaking case.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that for the families of these victims, the search for answers never really ends.
It never ends right. And the final victim we're going to talk about is Dawn Mendez. She was 25 years old.
She was last seen walking to a family event, and her remains were thankfully identified using fingerprints.
Right. So this case really, highlights how far forensics had come even back then.
Right. DNA profiling was still pretty new back then, but even those early forensic techniques played a crucial role in the investigation.
Right. Okay. So we've established the victims, and how tragic this case really was. Now let's turn our attention to the suspects and, the men who kind of became the focus of the investigation.
Yeah, and this is where the New Bedford Highway Killer case really takes a turn, because we have these individuals who all raise suspicions for different reasons, and they all have connections to the victims and their own set of unanswered questions.
Right. And each of them, I think, really deserve its own deep dive.
Absolutely.
So let's start with Anthony DeGrazia. DeGrazia's name comes up pretty early in the investigation, right?
Yeah, he was a construction worker, and he was actually looked at as a suspect in some assaults on sex workers in the area.
So even before the murder started?
But he was never charged with any of the highway killings.
Okay, but his story doesn't end there, does it? I mean, the circumstances surrounding his death are just so suspicious.
Yeah, so just a month after being cleared as a suspect in the murders,
Right.
DeGrazia was found dead.
And they ruled it a suicide.
That's right, suicide. But the autopsy report indicated signs of homicide.
So what was going on there? Was this a cover-up? Did someone have a motive to silence DeGrazia?
Well, his mother certainly thought so. She actually filed a lawsuit against the DA's office, for wrongful prosecution
Yeah.
and for failing to investigate his death properly.
So we're left with this dead suspect and no real answers about whether he was involved or not.
What a big question mark.
Huge question mark. All right, so let's move on to suspect number 2, Kenneth Ponte. And this is where things get really complicated because, as we mentioned, he was a lawyer who represented some of the victims.
Not only represented them, but knew them personally.
Right, and not always in a good way. I mean, he had a history of drug use himself and was even rumored to be involved in the drug trade.
Right, and there were some allegations that he was exploiting some of these women.
Which is just awful. I mean, it paints a whole different picture of him, right?
It does, yeah. He goes from being this lawyer who just happens to know some of the victims to someone who might have had power over them, someone
Yeah.
who could manipulate or coerce them.
Right, and remember, he was actually charged with the murder of Rochelle Dopirala, who he had dated.
Yeah, and the police, they searched his property. They were looking for evidence.
And they couldn't find anything.
They couldn't find anything concrete, so the charges were eventually dropped.
And he maintained his innocence until his death in 2010.
Died at home.
Yeah.
And it was never officially ruled a suicide, but, there were questions.
Always questions, right? So 2 of our main suspects end up dead. I mean, it's almost too coincidental.
It does make you wonder if they knew something they shouldn't have.
It really does. All right, so suspect number 3, Daniel Tavares. His story is completely different. He was already in prison for murdering his own mother when he sent a letter claiming responsibility for the highway killings.
Talk about a curveball, right? What made him confess to these crimes, especially from behind bars?
Right, and he claimed to have knowledge of the area and even knew another murder victim, Gail Botello, whose murder was never officially linked to the New Bedford Highway Killer case.
Right, and that's what makes his confession so difficult to evaluate. Was he being truthful? Was he just seeking attention?
Maybe trying to get a better deal, in prison.
Or was he genuinely involved?
Right, and to make things even more confusing, there's no direct evidence linking him to the highway killings.
He was eventually convicted of Gail Botello's murder.
But the highway killings remain unsolved.
Unsolved.
Officially unsolved. So could he be a red herring? Someone trying to throw the investigators off the scent?
It's possible he could have been trying to protect someone, or he just liked the attention.
Yeah, who knows? All right. And then just when you think this case can't get any weirder, you have this possible connection to another unsolved case, the Lisbon Ripper.
Right, have you heard of that one?
I haven't. Tell me more.
Okay, so between 1992 and 1993, 3 sex workers were murdered in Lisbon, Portugal. And because of the brutality of the crimes and the fact that they specifically targeted sex workers, investigators started calling the unknown killer the Lisbon Ripper.
Okay, and what does that have to do with the New Bedford Highway Killer?
Well, there are a lot of similarities in the cases.
Yeah.
The choice of victims, the way they were killed, even the way some of the bodies were posed.
Oh, wow. And didn't New Bedford have a pretty large Portuguese community?
That's right.
So were investigators thinking that maybe the killer could have traveled back and forth between the U.S. and Portugal?
Absolutely. They were looking into that possibility. Both the Portuguese and American authorities were trying to figure out if there was a link.
Did they ever catch the Lisbon Ripper?
Well, the case is considered solved because a man eventually confessed to the murders. But because of the statute of limitations in Portugal, he couldn't be prosecuted.
Wow. So there's a confessed killer just walking free. That's terrifying.
It is, and it really raises questions about, justice and accountability, and it certainly didn't give any closure to the families of the victims.
No, not at all. And it doesn't really help us solve the new Bedford Highway Killer case either.
No, it just adds another layer of mystery.
We've got these three suspects, DeGrazia, Ponte, and Tavares, all with their own connections to the victims, their own weird circumstances. And then this possible international connection with the Lisbon Ripper, it's almost too much to wrap your head around.
That's what's so fascinating about cold cases. They often leave us with more questions than answers.
Right. But even with all these unanswered questions, there must be some theories, right, about who might be responsible. So what are some of the prevailing ideas about who did it?
Well, one theory is that there wasn't just one killer, right? Maybe some of the murders were copycats, or maybe you had two or more people working together.
Yeah, that would make sense. It would explain, some of the inconsistencies in the MO and why the victims were found in different locations.
Exactly. And then there's the question of whether the killer or killers just stopped or moved on. Maybe they died or went to prison for something else or just decided to stop killing.
Or maybe they're still out there somewhere.
That's a chilling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that I think keeps people so fascinated by these cases.
Yeah.
The idea that the perpetrator could still be out there.
It's terrifying and intriguing all at the same time.
It is. What really strikes me about this case is how it sort of highlights the limitations of investigation.
Yeah.
Back then.
Yeah.
We talked about forensic technology, DNA and things like that. But there's also just the issue of resources.
Mm-hmm.
These women, many of them were living on the margins of society, and they didn't always get the same level of attention, from law enforcement as other victims might have.
That's a really good point. Do you think that if these crimes happen today with all the advancements we have, in DNA analysis, surveillance technology, even social media tracking, do you think the outcome might have been different?
I mean, it's hard to say for certain, but I do think the odds of catching the perpetrator, would be a lot higher.
Yeah.
We have so many more tools at our disposal now,
Mm-hmm.
But even then, there are always challenges, and some cases, unfortunately, just slip through the cracks.
It makes you wonder how many other New Bedford Highway Killer cases are out there, just waiting to be solved with the technology we have today.
I think that's a very real possibility.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to the importance of going back and looking at these cold cases, with fresh eyes,
Right.
re-examining the evidence and applying new techniques. You never know what might turn up.
That's true. You never know. Well, this deep dive has been both fascinating and incredibly sad. These women deserve justice, and it's just heartbreaking that their cases remain unsolved.
I agree. It's a reminder that behind every unsolved case, there are real people, real families who are still searching for answers.
So what can our listeners do now if they want to learn more about the new Bedford Highway Killer case or even contribute to the effort to find the truth?
Well, there are a lot of great resources online, articles, podcasts, documentaries, and if anyone has any information, no matter how small it may seem, they should definitely contact the authorities.
Yeah.
Sometimes the smallest detail can be the thing that, cracks a case wide open.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating and thought-provoking topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the memory of these victims alive.